I now have the pleasure of introducing one of our guest speakers today, Captain Craig Eisenbeis, U.S. Coast Guard retired. Captain Eisenbeis joined the U.S. Coast Guard in 1968 upon graduation from Oregon State University. After being commissioned as an officer, his first assignment was as port security officer in Corpus Christi, Texas. This was followed by 2 shipyard tours, which included service off the Asian coast in 1971 and the Bering Sea in 73 through 74. He next served as an investigator and marine safety inspector in Seattle before being placed in charge of the Marine Safety Detachment in Bucksport, Maine. In 1980, he assumed the duties as executive officer in Valdez, Alaska, at the end of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline. He subsequently served at the Coast Guard's Pacific Area Headquarters, first as a hearing officer and later in war planning during the Gulf War as part of a joint command with the United States Navy. In 1990, he received a graduate degree with highest distinction from the U.S. Naval War College, and next served as commanding officer of the Coast Guard's Marine Safety Office in Wilmington, North Carolina, as a Commander Coast Guard Forces, North Carolina. He retired in 1996 as the Coast Guard's Chief Administrative Officer for Alaska. He is a recipient of 5 Coast Guard Commendation Medals and the Meritorious Service Medal. He has been married to Kathleen Lowry Eisenbeis for 47 years. They have 4 children and 7 grandchildren, and he now works as a writer. Please join me in welcoming Captain Eisenbeis.
My name's Jerome Grant. I'm going to introduce Craig, who I wrangled down here. I want to tell you a little story of how I met Craig. Early in this new millennium, my wife, thankfully, and Grace Strom hired me as a waiter to work part-time at the Sea Hag. And it was one night I was waiting on 2 couples, and I always like to present a little flair when I would present the bill or along the way to upgrade my tip. And as I was, the 2 couples gave me credit cards, and I walked back, ran it, and got the receipts, and went back to the table, and I always would look at the name on the credit cards. Well, and I turned first to a couple, not Craig and his wife, but I said, "Thank you very much for coming in, Mr. and Mrs. Lee." And then I turned to Craig, and he looked up at me and he said, "That was easy. Try this one." I looked down at his name, and I thought, a little light went off in my head. I said, "Well, thank you very much, Mr. Eisenbeis." And he had a little startled look on his face, and he said, "How did you know how to say my name?" I said, "There's really there could not possibly be a connection." So he said, "No, I've got to know." I said, "No, really." So I walked away from the table, and Craig followed me down the hallway. He said, please tell me, how did you know how to pronounce my name?" And I said, "Well, in 1960, my first teacher, wonderful woman, incredible, she could do everything. Her name was Mrs. Eisenbeis." He said, Craig hesitated for a moment, and he said, "Where did you go to school?" And I said, "Well, Forest Hills and Elementary in Lake Oswego." Craig said, "That teacher is my mother, and she's still alive." So consequently, many visits through the years, he brought his mother and dad to meet me and see me again here in Depoe Bay. And I know that Depoe Bay is a real special place for Craig and Kathy, his wife. I think they're very special people, and I invited him down here to speak. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Craig Eisenbeis, Captain Craig Eisenbeis.
Well, thank you, Jerome. That was a very fine introduction. Obviously, my mother did a good job of your education. So, well, it's Memorial Day, and of course, the Depoe Bay Fleet of Flowers. Having been retired for quite a few years, I sort of assumed that by now people would have forgotten about me. So I'm a little surprised to find myself here today at the speaker's podium. I'm even a little more surprised to find that I could still fit into my uniform. Memorial Day, originally known as Decoration Day, for the custom of decorating the graves of fallen soldiers, was first observed within days of the end of the Civil War. It remains a day on which to remember fallen service members, and we do so today. The city of Depoe Bay, however, has taken that concept even further to encompass all those lost at sea and who offer up their lives in the service of others. So today's event is about remembrance, but it's also about selflessness and sacrifice, simply being willing to care about others. Unlike much of today's social and political discourse, which too often highlights selfishness and disregard for others, today's event rightly focuses on selflessness and sacrifice. That Depoe Bay's annual Fleet of Flowers should be about these virtues is a tribute not just to those who seek to serve and save, but to the culture of an entire community that embraces those values. Not everyone can, or even should, attempt the kind of life-endangering sacrifice that inspired the founding of this event. For those of you who do not know the story, this Fleet of Flowers observance was established in 1945 to commemorate the heroic efforts of two fishermen, Roy Bauer and Jack Chambers, who in 1936 lost their lives in a storm at sea while attempting to save the lives of others. As noted earlier, both men received the Carnegie Medal for Heroism. A monument to their heroic effort was erected in 1937 and still stands on the Depoe Bay seawall by the Spouting Horn. So, how does one become a hero? Some people seek to serve, and others have service thrust upon them. Roy Bauer and Jack Chambers did not seek to die, but they did answer the call and accept the risk to serve when others were threatened. I can't imagine talking about sacrifice and service at sea without mention of the Coast Guard, especially since I rather suspect that my own connections with the Coast Guard are responsible for my having been invited to be here today. Over the years, like Jack Chambers and Roy Bauer, many Coast Guard personnel have also lost their lives in the service of others. Chambers and Bauer were not members of the Coast Guard, but they definitely embodied, quite literally, an unofficial motto of the Coast Guard. You have to go out, but you don't have to come back. We are honored by the presence here today of many of our local Coast Guard service members. I am merely history, but these men and women are the face of our service today. Be sure to take the time to thank them for all they do to make your world a safer one. If you'll bear with me a couple of minutes, I'd like to talk a little bit about the Coast Guard. Surprisingly, the service of the Coast Guard is much farther reaching than many people realize. For example, people are often surprised to learn that my first shipboard tour found us off the Asian coast and eventually into post-war Japan. My own Coast Guard career of nearly 3 decades might never have happened were it not for my father's Coast Guard service during World War II. And that's also a story of being willing to serve. Mere weeks after Pearl Harbor and the U.S. entry into that war, my father joined the Coast Guard Reserve under what I like to call the BYOB program. That's Bring Your Own Boat. There were no resources at that time to provide wartime coastal defense and port security for our nation, and that gave birth to the BYOB program. My father and a friend bought an old Chris-Craft and joined up. For the first year of the war, they patrolled the Columbia River from Astoria to Bonneville Dam to guard against foreign incursions and saboteurs. After that first year, the government finally built military picket boats to take over the job, and my father spent the rest of the war in the Pacific on a Coast Guard patrol frigate that included service in the Aleutian Islands and the invasion of the Philippines, but that's a story for another time. During that first year of Coast Guard service, my father became acquainted with another citizen participant in the emergency creation of a coastal defense force. His name was Stan Allen, and he was from Depoe Bay. If you haven't heard the name before, it's on a bronze plaque at the channel entrance to Depoe Bay near the Whale Watching Center. Stan had established Tradewinds charters here in Depoe Bay in 1938, shortly before the war. Stan's new boat, the fabled Kingfisher, was built of Port Orford cedar and was completed just months before the U.S. entry into the war. Stan volunteered himself and his boat to the Coast Guard. The Kingfisher was a much more substantial addition to the Coast Guard fleet than my father's Chris-Craft, and its offshore capability was an important addition to the Coast Guard mission when other resources simply did not exist. The role of Stan Allen in the Kingfisher in World War II is just another example of how the people of Depoe Bay have a long tradition of stepping up to the plate to help serve others. Like my father, Stan finished out the war in the Pacific, but on a subchaser. But what primarily brings us all together today is to remember those who have been lost to us. Where better to start than with a fellow Coast Guardsman who passed away a few weeks ago. Here is someone who both embodied the spirit and self-sacrifice and who is now lost to us. Master Chief David Duran served in the Coast Guard from 1965 until his retirement in 1993. He was cited for heroism in 1979 while serving here in Depoe Bay, when he took part in the rescue of 2 men in the heavy surf off the Siletz River Bar. Master Chief Duran was cited for heroism again in 1980 for his part in the rescue of 3 boys stranded on rocks right over here by Fogarty Creek State Park. We do well to remember and respect the raw power and majesty of the sea. I know that Master Chief Duran did. In addition to his other honors, the Master Chief received the Douglas A. Monroe Award for Inspirational Leadership in 1981 while serving as officer in charge of the Coast Guard station right here in Depoe Bay. A native Oregonian, Master Chief Duran accomplished something I was never able to achieve in my career, that of being stationed in Oregon. In fact, in addition to multiple tours here in Depoe Bay, he served most of his career up and down the Oregon coast. I served all over the country, but had to retire in order to get back home to Oregon. So today, we mourn Master Chief Duran's passing, but celebrate what he contributed to Depoe Bay and to the Oregon coast. He may be gone, but the tradition he came to represent lives on in the Coast Guard service members we see here today. We are reminded of the fragility of life, and the best thing we can do in his memory is vow each day to honor all those who pass among us. So today in particular, we honor those we have lost, whether it's a stranger from Georgia, like Kelly Smith, swept from the rocks into the sea, or someone who grew up right here amongst us in Depoe Bay, like Katie Rowe, missing for weeks, then sadly found in the ocean. Perhaps there have also been persons lost whom we were never aware of, which is all the more reason why we should honor everyone every day. We need not risk our lives or even sacrifice greatly to honor others. We simply need to treat others as we would like for ourselves and our loved ones to be treated. I can't help but think of the recent poor example of the tow truck driver in North Carolina who refused to assist a disabled woman in a disabled car because her car sported a bumper sticker for a presidential candidate that was not his choice. We should be better than that. We can be better than that. We are better than that. And we can all be heroes simply by honoring others. As the Irish statesman Edmund Burke famously said, the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. So, if we are to truly honor the lives and past sacrifices of those who have passed on before us, there are things that each of us can do to be heroes in today's world. They need not be big things, and they need not be actions of great sacrifice, but they should and must be done. Together, we can all make a difference. So, thank you.